Salutations to the Truth Core, whoever or wherever you may be on the planet. I'm here today to tell you about the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, which was exact on December 21st, 2020, just about 2 weeks ago. Now you see that I've titled this talk, What the 2020 Jupiter-Saturn conjunction signals for the future of humanity. Take note of that word signals. I'll get back to it in a second. I could, of course, as well have said signifies. And indeed, I will talk about what that conjunction signifies, what it indicates for the future of humanity and human society as we see it in the world today. I use the expression signal because the conjunction is exactly that. Imagine that you're at a race course. You're sitting in the stands and you're looking down at a large circular or oval area, which is the race course. Let's say that it's a horse race. A number of horses are lined up at the gate. They all have their noses in exactly the same line, so it's a fair and even start. And so what happens to start the race? Well, there's a bang, a sharp bang. And that is the sound of the starting gun. And at that moment, the gates are opened and the horses proceed in the race going around the oval track. And you may recall that the term for one complete circle around the oval track is called a lap. So when a horse runs all the way around the track and returns to the position of the starting gate, that's one lap. And a race might consist of one lap, or it might consist of several laps, L-A-P. So, what happened on December 21st, 2020, a couple of weeks ago? You might think, and many astrologers would agree, that that exact moment was significant in and of itself, just that moment, just what happened immediately before, during, and after that moment. And that was it. Well, it's true that you could only observe those planets in close conjunction in the sky at that exact moment. But that exact moment is equivalent to the firing of the starting gun. That begins a race. And that race is going to last 20 years. So if you think of a lap in time rather than a lap in space around the racetrack, then the first lap of Jupiter and Saturn has begun, and it will run for 20 years. So you follow the analogy. The signal of the exact conjunction starts the race, and the race runs for 20 years. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to describe to you what's involved in this race, what's happening in human society, what can happen, and what are the challenges and problems that will come about during this 20-year lap of Jupiter and Saturn. Therefore, and in a larger sense, what all that signifies for the future of humanity. In order to present that to you in a clear description, in some way that will be helpful and instructive, I need first to put you into the big picture. It is a fact that Jupiter and Saturn conjunctions happen every 20 years. So the last one was in the year 2000. Before that, it was 1980, and so forth, going back in 20-year intervals, all the way back as far as you want to go. However, That obvious fact of astronomy tracking planetary cycles and conjunctions tends to conceal a more significant fact, which is that the development of this race in 20-year lapse has a comprehensive design that extends or extrapolates into a rhythm of 60 years. Well, how is that so? Sticking to the analogy of the racetrack, you can say that the current lap, one time around the racetrack, of 20 years, is part of a 3-lap event that runs for 60 years. This is simply an astronomical fact, and you can track it and observe it if you plot these conjunctions around the racetrack of the zodiac, which happens to be a study that I've done many times over the last 50 years. And what you need to bear in mind then are 2 cycles of succession. In one cycle, the conjunctions occur successively every 20 years. So the present conjunction will recur in 2040, 2060, and 2080. But there is a greater cycle of succession in which the conjunctions are plotted in intervals of 60 years. Why is that so? Well, imagine that Jupiter and Saturn are 2 horses, and Jupiter is the faster horse. The moment that the starting gun is fired, the 2 horses leap into the race. But quite quickly, and you can watch this in the sky, not now, but later in the spring when Jupiter and Saturn appear in the morning sky, Jupiter, the faster horse, advances. And so Jupiter makes the total round of the racetrack and catches up with Saturn because Saturn is slower. So Jupiter will go around the racetrack, and in 20 years, it will catch up with Saturn again. And at that point, the 2 horses will be at another place on the oval or circular racetrack. Jupiter will not catch up with Saturn at the starting line of the 2020 lap. There is a regular pattern showing how this happens. On an average of about 244 degrees. So the place where the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction will happen 20 years from now is 244 degrees around the circle from where it is now. And again, in 2060, it will be also about 240 degrees from the starting line in 2020. And if you plot that out, what happens is that it forms a great triangle. So those 3 conjunctions, 2020, 2040, and 2060, form the points of a great triangle in the sky. So what happens next? What happens in 2080, 60 years from now? Now remember that over this 60-year period, there are 3 successive conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn in time. And they form a triangle. But when you arrive at the 60-year cycle, something very interesting occurs. And that is that Jupiter catches up with Saturn once again at the end of the lap. And the place where that happens is very close to the starting line of the 2020 conjunction. So you see there's a 20-year cycle, 3 laps, and then a larger 60-year cycle. So now, if you would choose to engage in a study, which can be quite elaborate, of tracking these cycles back in historical time, you'll find that you have two options. You can go back 20 years at a time and look at what happened and try to make sense of it. For instance, you can go back to the year 2000, the last time there was a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. And then you can go back to 1980, 20 years at a time, and you can look at each individual lap, and you can read the cycle in that way. But there's another way to read the cycle. That's what I'm going to show you. I'm going to explain how to read the cycle on the 60-year rhythm. So if you go back in 60-year jumps, 60-year intervals, you get a succession of dates like this. 2020, 1960, 1901, 1842, 1782, 1723. They're not exactly precisely 20-year cycles. They vary a little bit, 2021, hence the days. Now that is a mighty interesting sequence of dates. And perhaps the first interval may have really caught your attention. You track from 2020 back to 1960. 1960, my friends. So, in this system that I'm explaining to you, the elementary system for interpreting Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions, the 2020 conjunction is the follow-up of the 1960 conjunction. Now, I don't know how old you are, or if you've ever heard about the 60s, but I can guarantee you they were everything, both good and bad, that you may have ever heard about them. It was a tremendous and unparalleled revolutionary moment. So if you regard the 2020 conjunction as the direct successor and follow-up of 1960, you might just get a sense of things to come. I just want to add that there are, of course, many astrologers who would interpret this pattern, which is an astronomical fact, according to the 20-year lapse. They would look at one lap at a time. So they would go back and say, oh, such and such happened in the year 2000, the last time they were conjunct, and then such and such happened in the year 1980. And many astrologers will follow the lapse. But what I'm doing here is introducing you to the comprehensive pattern of the 3-lap cycle of 60 years. It's much more significant and accurate if you're intending to plot the social events and changes and improvements and challenges that occur in this time frame. So far, so good. So, how to proceed from here? On what basis would I present an interpretation of the significance of this 60-year cycle? Well, I invite you to return for a moment to the visualization of the Great Triangle. The conjunctions that happen at 20-year intervals happen at 3 different points that make a triangle. Remember? This triangle is called the Great Trigon of Jupiter and Saturn. And it is and has been throughout history a matter of enormous interest to both astrologers and astronomers. So for the illustration for this talk, provided a drawing of the Great Trigon taken from the famous astronomer Johannes Kepler. And you will see from Kepler's design that the triangle formed at the 20-year points actually rotates through the sky. What does this mean? It means that the starting line of the 2020 conjunction is at a certain position in the sky. And 60 years later, when the race returns to that point, well, Jupiter and Saturn start another lap, another set of 3 laps at the starting line of 2020. Can you picture that? But not quite. Due to the fact that the triangle or trigon rotates through the sky in a counterclockwise direction, the starting line in 2080 is a little bit ahead, a little bit further down the racetrack than the starting line of 2020. So, if you're into these things, and if you're inclined to plot them out against the pattern of stars in the sky, you can see how the point of the triangle moves through the sky in 60-year intervals. However, astrologers don't do that. Not exactly. You could probably go on the internet right now and spend 20 hours reading astrologers who are interpreting the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. But those astrologers don't do it in the same way that I do, because I have another method. I refer the conjunctions in time and in space to where they actually occur against the background of the stars. Astrologers don't use the stars, and they don't look at the stars. They use a format called the tropical zodiac, which is like a template of 12 equal sections, Aries, Taurus, Gemini. So they would say the current Jupiter-Saturn conjunction of 2020 occurs in 1 degree of the sign Aquarius. And they will talk about its significance in relation to the sign Aquarius. But I don't do that, because I'm not using the tropical astrology format. I'm using a different format, which is the stellar zodiac, the real sky zodiac. So I'm considering the position of Jupiter and Saturn as it actually stands, where they actually conjuncted precisely against the background of the observable stars, which astrologers totally ignore. So that will give you an idea of how I develop a framework for interpreting the significance of the conjunction. What do? I look at that point of the triangle that's moving on a 60-year cycle, and I track it back, and then I come forward with it again, and I look at where those conjunctions, 1842, 1901, 1960, 2020, I look at where they actually occurred in the constellations. And then I interpret the significance of those conjunctions and of the whole rhythm based on the material that I have accumulated for the constellations. Now, what happens if I start talking about the constellations? Well, it's likely that you will get completely lost very fast, because you don't know anything about them and what they signify. The 2020 conjunction occurs in the constellation of the Goatfish, or sea goat. That has nothing to do with the sign Aquarius. The preceding conjunctions in that 60-year cycle 1960, 1901, 1842, 1782, progressed through a particular constellation, the constellation of the Archer, which has nothing to do with Sagittarius. So I am tracking forward the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, say, from, 1782, when it occurred in alignment with the Galactic Center. What do you think about that? And tracking it forward in 1842, 1901, 1960, it moved through the constellation of the Archer, and then in 2020, it shifted into the constellation of the Goatfish. And in fact, it happened, to use mythopoetic language, which is the medium for reading the constellations, it happened in the face of the Goatfish, in the gaze of the Goatfish. And this is a constellation based on an ancient mythological figure which has in front the head and neck and forelegs of a goat, and it has the tail of a fish. So the 2021 conjunction happened before the face of the Goatfish, or actually in the face. And it was aligned to the stars that mark the eye and the horns of the Goatfish. So there you have a mythopoetic trope. The Goatfish is looking at something. The Goatfish has a gaze. The Goatfish has a vision. And this vision becomes a reality for humanity over the 20-year lap, until the next time Jupiter catches up with Saturn at another point on the triangle. So in fact, even though I'm talking about the larger comprehensive 60-year cycle, the first lap of that cycle is completed in 2040. Then there's a second lap and a third lap, and then Jupiter and Saturn come around again to the Goatfish. So in 2080, they will again conjunct in that constellation, although the position where that conjunction occurs will be about 10 to 12 degrees more advanced into the constellation. Remember that the starting gate moves every 80 years. And it moves by about 12 degrees, which you can see if you do the graphics and you track it, that point of the trigon, as it advances counterclockwise through the natural order of the zodiac, the real observable star patterns in the sky, not the astrological signs. All right, so far so good. I don't know if you have followed me or if you appreciate what I've done to set up this explanation for you. It takes time to explain these things, and it takes time to learn these things. What I'm actually talking about are tools that I have used for many years, and I've taught others to use in the field of what I call forensic astronomy, or celestics. So that's a little lesson in celestics. And now let's go to the takeaway. What does the 2020 Jupiter-Saturn conjunction signify for the future of humanity? Well, it has a tremendous and far-reaching significance. It is an outstanding conjunction of great importance and great urgency. Now, to come across to you in a user-friendly way, I'm going to tell you what I make out of this conjunction, how I interpret it. But I'm not going to tell you how I arrive at that interpretation, except on 2 points. First point I've already made. This conjunction marks the beginning of a 20-year cycle that is the follow-up of the 20-year cycle that began in 1960. So there is continuity between the events between 1960 and 1980 and the events in the future between 2020 and 2040. There is something like a higher octave of development in play here, but with repeating themes, similar themes of challenges and advances to be made in society during the lap that is now beginning. Second point concerns the constellation of the Goatfish. So I'm going to describe 3 massive trends in social behavior and social upheaval that will transpire over the next 20 years. And I base the characterization of those great trends, those massive currents and upheavals of social life, upon my pre-existing knowledge of the constellation of the Goatfish. All in all, this conjunction signals a period of recovery. In particular, the recovery of human sanity. As I read it, the coming 20 years will be a time in human history when the battle to recover sanity will reach a culmination. 20 years, a 20-year lap of the Jupiter-Saturn race has for its overriding goal the recovery of sanity in all areas of human life, social life, culture, economics, the arts, you name it. This battle for sanity unfolds along 3 fronts. It's a battle to be fought on more than one front at a time. First front is the area of ecology. One of the themes of the constellation of the Goatfish is conservatism, strange as that may sound. Conservatism. See, the Goatfish is there in the sky. It has the head of a goat or gazelle, and it's gazing out across space into another area of the sky. And what is implied by the gaze of the Goatfish? Well, that is the gaze of humanity looking into the future. But what establishes the way that humanity sees the future, or any society or culture? For instance, if you live in Ireland, what establishes the general mindset of the people of Ireland in their view of their own future? Well, it depends on what they want to conserve and preserve that will be there in the future. You see? So the attitude of conservatism actually supports a vision of the future. And that is the sane way to look at the future. What's happening today under the onslaught of transhumanism and the technocrats is that they want you to see the future in the way they see it, which is a post-human future and a post-truth future. And if they have their way and their agenda of the Great Reset is successful, they will wipe out everything that would otherwise be preserved by sane human animals. They will destroy the conservative outlook and replace it with their insane transhumanist view of the future. That is the battle that is currently underway. So reclaiming conservative values and standing for what you want to keep from the past, you want to preserve it, honor it, and keep it, and make it better, and go into the future in that conservative attitude, that's the responsibility that you face. To do that in your life, in your community, in your nation, and with your people. So every nation in the world, especially the Western, European, Euro-American world, is now faced with this challenge. How to have a viable, vibrant, sane, and happy future by conserving the things that really matter, rather than going down into oblivion by following the transhumanist agenda, which openly states that it will destroy humanity. You know, one of the lines in the Great Reset Manifesto is, they are going to change what it means to be human. Well, I don't recall them asking me about that. I don't recall them asking me if I wanted to change what I think it means to be human. I happen to very much enjoy my sense of humanity and what I think it means to be human. And I'm not going to allow anybody to change it. I'm going to conserve it, and preserve it as a foundation for a sustainable future, for a free, honest, and sustainable world to live in. You see that? This is what I'm getting at when I'm using this word conservative, putting a particular spin on it. So the first thing will be the battle for a sane ecological viewpoint. That means going to war against the New Green Deal, going to war against the climate change fear-mongering, which is completely bogus science, going to war against the notion of zero carbon emissions, which is entirely insane. We are animals who breathe out carbon dioxide. Plants breathe it in. Carbon dioxide is a component of the biosphere. The goal of net zero carbon emissions, or zero carbon, which is a mantra you continually hear, is something coming out of the terminal dementia of those people who have fallen into the clutches of the globalist overlords. All the goals of transhumanism and the technocratic agenda for the future are insane. This conjunction signals the battle to recover sanity and to run society and live in society in a sane way that is shared and supported and enjoyed by those who embrace it. The second front is the field of education. Now, one of the reasons why the COVID-19 scam succeeds is because huge numbers of people in the world take their education daily from the mainstream news. And that's just part of the problem. The entire educational system of the Euro-American world, the culture of the West, has been corrupted for decades. If you want to go back to the previous conjunction in the long cycle, go back to 1960. I hit the ground running in 1960. I was 15 years old, and I lived through that interval from 1960 to 1980 in vivid existential confrontation with the problems of my time. So I'm a veteran of the 60 generation. And I can tell you that even then, the corruption of the educational system in the colleges, in the universities, was starting to become horrific. Just imagine what it is 60 years later. That is indicative of the Marxist plan, the long march through the institutions, cultural Marxism. So cultural Marxism really started to get some tremendous shred and to take over the minds of the young generation in my generation. And I resisted that tooth and nail. I dropped out of college even though I was an honors student. And I refused to go along with that part of the youth revolution that I saw instinctively was being directed in a way that was not true. Something was wrong. And of course, what I was seeing, even though I wasn't able to define it so well at the time, I was seeing the cultural Marxist takeover that intensified after the 1960 conjunction. But at the same time, I represent what was true and good about that conjunction, which was about that movement, which was genuine. And I'm still here. I'm still surviving, you see? So there is a lot of truth and true empowerment of the youth that came out of that conjunction, which you don't hear about because the cultural Marxists on the campuses of the universities co-opted the entire movement. And so did the CIA, of course. And some of you, I'm sure, know a little bit about that whole scenario. So one of the first things that happens with the crack of the starting gun in December 2020 is that people all around the world who hear that signal wake up to the fact that society has been miseducated in a really evil and devious way. We've been miseducated about the climate. We've been miseducated about biology. The Great Reset and the COVID-19 scam depends entirely on the miseducation of the public, feeding them lies, the lie of scientific consensus, feeding the lie of germ theory. Untold thousands of medical students who've been through college have been miseducated in germ theory so that they think that this virus is real, you see. So overthrowing the massive effects of miseducation and re-establishing the education of the public, of your friends and families, re-establishing it on a totally new basis is one of the battlefronts of this 20-year lap. Third front is one that concerns me intimately. And I will characterize this front with a meme: the rise of the Calicas. So who are the Calicas? I'm suggesting that immediately now in 2021, and the race is on, and Jupiter is already advancing beyond Saturn. So Jupiter will go the full round of the racetrack in 12 years. It takes Saturn 29 and a half years to go the full round of the racetrack. So Jupiter is racing ahead, and in 12 years it would return to the starting gate. And then, of course, the slower horse, Saturn, has advanced along the racetrack, so it takes a little more time, 8 more years, for Jupiter to catch up with Saturn, and there they are again, neck and neck, in 2040. So what happens in the next 20 years on this front of the battleground, of the war for sanity? The rise of the Calicas. Now, a Calica is a term for someone who is a devotee of the Hindu goddess Kali, or Kali. And Kali is a figure, plays a great role in my life. In fact, Kali is my guardian. But when I talk about Kali, I ask you to divest yourself of whatever you may have heard about that goddess in the genre of Hindu or Indian society and Hindu or Indian religion. I certainly do not worship Kali in the way that Hindus in India do, and I've been to their places. I've been to Kali Ghat, where they burn bodies in Calcutta. I've watched them. I used to spend my afternoons there. And I know what happens at the temples and shrines of Kali in India, and the sacrifice of chickens and the rubbing of the chicken blood on the statue. But this has nothing to do with those practices. When I talk to you about Kali, I'm talking about the shock goddess and the war goddess. And she belongs to a gang of very, very powerful supernatural agencies. When you investigate planetary tantra and you learn about the Shakti cluster, you encounter these supernatural powers, these goddess forces, which are all expressions of one supreme goddess, the Aeon Sophia, who is your divine mother, the living earth. So Kali is a warrior force that comes out of the earth, but it becomes your force when you become a Kalika. So as a Kalika, you're a warrior, but you have the boost of the earth to support you. You're not simply a warrior acting from your own power and energy, but your power is coupled with the power of the shock goddess. So there are shocks coming. The shocks are happening right now. And one expression or one proof of those shocks, by the way, is the spectacular display of volcanic eruptions that has been underway through December and continuing into 2021. Those are expressions of the rage of the planetary animal mother. And those geophysical expressions are reflected by the changes that are now due to happen in the social order. So the rise of the Kalikas refers to the requirement in this 20-year period for certain individuals in communities, in nations around the world, to take responsibility to go to war against false power and false authority. So when you see these video clips of certain people standing up and talking back to the police, again, that tactic of arrogation, what you're seeing is the emergence of the Kalikas. People standing in their power and challenging the authorities and the illusion of power and the whole massive scheme of lies upon which the authorities operate. That system is going down fast. And those who will take it down to the bottom, to complete demolition, down to the rubble, on the cremation ground of Kali. That's where it's all going. The Great Reset, the World Economic Forum, every massive global authority, the Bank of International Settlements, the Rothschild central banking system, all the institutions of power, all the so-called humanitarian institutions, Amnesty International, the NGOs, the countless phony humanitarian organizations, they're all going down into the rubble of the cremation ground of Kali, the shock goddess. And those who will carry that demolition to its final moment in the battle are those people I call Kalikas, and I count myself as one of those. I'm in the band of Kali. In fact, I'm the leader of that band, and Kali is my sacred guardian. So needless to say, there's a power struggle underway that can only intensify. It can only get better as it gets worse. Sure, it'll get worse. That's called dystropic escalation. But at the same time that it gets worse, it will also get better. And every day, every single day, you can count on more opportunities coming for the recovery of sanity along these three fronts: in ecology and conservation of nature, and the right relation of society to the natural setting, in the reform of education, and even including the restoration of the humanities, which is one of my stated goals. Nematta is founded on the premise of restoration of the humanities. And finally, the struggle for power. The Kalikas are the guardians of the security of society in the future. You see, the problem, one of the core factors in the current problem today, is that societies around the world delegated to the authorities and politicians the power to guard and protect those societies. But it's becoming screamingly obvious that the guardians are corrupt. And everything they are doing is calculated to harm the members of society that they have been delegated to protect and lead, protect and guide. So where is the true protection and the true guidance going to come from? In the immediate future and over these next 20 years, it's going to come from those individuals in the community and in the nation who take responsibility for the future of their people. And that's the only place it comes from. As this battle proceeds, all of the authorities are going down. All of the people on the mainstream media who report lies dictated to them by the authorities are going down. All the police who are acting in the service of the authorities against society and against the sovereign individual are going down. They don't know it yet, but they are already pariahs. What I would say if I had to speak, say, to a law enforcement officer in the United States or in England, if I had to tell them something, if I chose, I would say, listen, it appears that you don't see the consequences of what you're doing. But I can tell you exactly what they are. Either you can have a job now and a life later, but you can't have both. So all those people who are supporting the system of social evil will be pariahs. They are already pariahs. They are already deeply hated. Do you know how much hate is directed toward the talking heads of the mainstream media who lie in an evil and conniving manner every single time they open their mouth? People like that have no life. They have no future in the beauty to come. They have no future in the society based on the recovery of sanity. But that recovery involves a battle. And Kali is the shock goddess. She's the war goddess. who oversees that battle for all that is good and free and beautiful in the future of humanity. There's a saying among the Calicoes, and it goes like this. It's a saying that comes from Kali herself. Either you are party to my supernatural magic, or you are rubble. Enough said, and I'll be seeing you in the beauty to come.